The wars in Vietnam and Korea were fought to contain the spread of communism in countries most Americans knew little about. Both demanded millions of lives, and both ended without a clear victory. Yet only one of them tore the nation apart at home. Only one sparked mass protests, cultural upheaval, and a deep lasting mistrust in government. So why is the Vietnam War remembered with resentment and regret, while the Korean War is so often forgotten in the United States? In this video, we'll examine the differences and similarities between the two conflicts, and try to understand why one became a national trauma and the other a forgotten war. How and when both wars started play a role in how they're remembered. The Korean War kicked off suddenly, right after North Korea invaded the South in 1950, making it clear-cut, an act of aggression that demanded a fast response. The United States stepped in quickly, with broad international backing under a United Nations mandate, giving the war an added sense of legitimacy. It is also important to remember that the Korean War started soon after World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War. The Second World War convinced many Americans that war could be the moral and effective option, reinforced by the fact that the United States emerged from the conflict relatively undamaged and even economically revitalized. World War II also cemented the belief that appeasement led to almost certain escalation. Meanwhile, the Cold War split the world into two hostile camps: Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, reports of repression in the Soviet bloc, and the fall of China deepened fears. With Germany still fresh in their memory, many Americans came to see communism as the new fascism. Korea resembled World War II so much that when Gallup polled Americans in 1950 and 1951, most believed they were fighting the early stages of World War III. Vietnam, on the other hand, created a generational rift in American society. Baby boomers who came of age during the conflict often opposed the war, especially in its later stages, while their parents, shaped by World War II and the early Cold War, tended to support US involvement as a patriotic duty and as a stand against communism. Additionally, Vietnam didn't begin with a clear enemy invasion. Instead, it was a slow escalation, with the US gradually increasing its involvement over the years. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 sparked full-scale American combat in Vietnam, but the war never had the same clear-cut cause or international legitimacy. By the time Vietnam became a major focus, the situation became significantly more convoluted than Korea. Apart from the generational context, the two wars were also drastically different when looking at the way they were fought. US involvement in Vietnam lasted around 20 years, 9 of those being direct military engagement. For the United States, the Vietnam War was a war of attrition and a war of numbers. This meant that the primary objective of the armed forces was to wear down the enemy by inflicting such heavy casualties that they couldn't replenish their ranks fast enough. In other words, rather than focusing on occupying territory, which was difficult due to Viet Cong's use of guerrilla tactics, the US military frequently aimed to maintain a kill ratio of at least 10 to 1, 10 enemy soldiers killed for every American one. Korea's battlefield looked completely different. The Korean War lasted just a little over 3 years, significantly shorter than the Vietnam War, and was characterized primarily by conventional warfare with clear front lines. This type of warfare was more reminiscent of what the public had witnessed during the Second World War, making it somewhat easier to understand what was happening on the battlefield, at least compared to the Vietnam War. While there was some guerrilla resistance during the Korean War, particularly in the Jirisan mountain region, North Korea and China never established a subversive force in the South that was even remotely comparable to the Viet Cong. Although the United States failed to achieve a clear victory in both wars, Korea and Vietnam also differ significantly in how they ended. The Vietnam War is widely seen as a costly failure, both in terms of American lives and resources, because it ended in a clear geopolitical defeat for the United States. Despite being portrayed throughout the conflict as a stable and legitimate government, South Vietnam relied almost entirely on US financial, logistical, and military support to survive. When American forces withdrew in 1973, South Vietnam struggled to maintain control, and by 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, effectively reunifying the country under communist rule. In contrast, although the Korean War did not result in a decisive victory for either side, it achieved a more favorable outcome for the United States. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a formal peace treaty, but it successfully established and maintained South Korea as a sovereign US-aligned state. It is also important to keep in mind several specific incidents during the Vietnam War that shattered public trust, most notably the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre. By January 1968, US troops had been fighting a full-scale ground war in Vietnam for over 3 years. The US government kept assuring the public again and again that the conflict was progressing according to plan and that North Vietnam was incapable of launching any sort of ambitious attack on US forces. What followed was the largest military operation conducted by either side up to that point in the war, the Tet Offensive. Although the United States managed to successfully fend off the attack carried out throughout South Vietnam, the Communist Tet Offensive significantly weakened domestic support for the Johnson administration, as the vivid reporting by the US media made clear to the American public that an overall victory in Vietnam was not imminent. Public support for the war would continue to decline until it was over. Then in 1969, the US public would become aware of one of the most brutal episodes of the Vietnam War. In March 1968, US soldiers killed over 500 unarmed civilians in My Lai, an atrocity the US military tried to cover up. The wider American public found out about the massacre a year later thanks to the efforts of several investigative journalists and witness testimonies. My Lai disgraced the US Army as an institution and soon became one of the symbols of anti-war protests in the United States. Together, these events, among many others, exposed deep flaws in the institutions Americans were told to trust, and in doing so, they ensured that the Vietnam War would not simply be remembered as a military failure, but as a moral and political catastrophe. Although the US forces did commit atrocities during the Korean War, none reached the wider American public during the conflict or in the decades that followed. Korea simply didn't have its own My Lai in the public consciousness, although there were incidents that could be considered parallels. The most notable example is the No Gun Ri massacre, when US soldiers killed hundreds of Korean civilians, many of them women and children. The massacre remains largely unknown in the United States to this day. It is worth noting that one additional factor compounded all of the failures of the Vietnam War and brought the brutality of the front lines directly into the living rooms of millions. And that was the role of media, but especially television, which is why Vietnam is sometimes labeled as the first television war in history. During the Korean War, television was still in its infancy. The imagery the US public saw was distant and sanitized, but by the 1960s, television had become a fixture in the average American home. Although the US media coverage of Vietnam mostly ranged from positive to neutral in the first 2 years of direct engagement, after the Tet Offensive, the tone began to shift when it became obvious that American victory in Vietnam was not imminent, despite the reassurances of the US government. Several other factors certainly made the Vietnam War one of the most infamous conflicts in US history, including the outrage over the government's discriminatory draft practices, the widespread use of the defoliant Agent Orange with its devastating health effects, and the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which exposed years of government deception about the war's progress. There is no single simple explanation for why the Vietnam War still resonates so strongly today compared to Korea. From the start of US military involvement to its end, the Vietnam conflict was steeped in controversy. While the Korean War certainly had its own PR troubles, its shorter duration, clearer objectives and enemies, and the fact that it did not end in outright defeat made it less divisive, especially in the years that followed. By contrast, Vietnam became a prolonged, bitter struggle that eroded public trust and fueled generational resistance, thereby leaving an enduring mark on US history.